Yes, hello and welcome to episode 2, series 1 of the UKRG Afternoon Chats. We are recording on Monday, the 11th of May. I'd like to introduce Carol Warner and Robert Graham. Carol Warner is UK Government Indemnity Manager at Arts Council England since 2014. Previously, she was Executive Manager, Head of Grants and Lottery Operations Manager at the Scottish Arts Council, now Creative Scotland, Project Manager for the transition to Creative Scotland, and has also worked for English Heritage, Arts and Business Scotland and the Greater London Council. Carol has an MBA, MA in Art History and Diploma in Law and Collections Management. Robert Graham has worked for Blackwall Green since 1986 and has been involved in all aspects of Blackwall Green's business. Robert has lectured to the UK and European registrars groups, and his advice is regularly sought by museums in Europe, Australia, Asia and the US. So Robert and Carol have agreed to field some questions on insurance indemnity today. Those questions that are hopefully at the forefront of people's minds in a short interview. So go on to the first question for you both. Obviously, everyone has been concerned about the protection of museums during the lockdown, but what do you see as the key risks as we plan to emerge from the restrictions? Do they stay the same, or do you see others emerging as artwork starts to move, for example?
Would you like to first? Okay. I think for indemnity, the risks generally stay the same. They may be heightened risks as other risk elements and factors become more apparent. They may be amplified. I think the main thing is we need to for indemnity, we need to stick to the guidance that's already been published, the general conditions in D and E, and just as we come out, as institutions come out of lockdown, there is obviously a shift in environment. So it's making sure that you're very familiar with the objects and where they are at the moment, and that you keep on top of the environmental controls and security. We issued guidance in March, which was to provide additional support for museums during this lockdown phase. And that guidance was particularly focused on those museums which can keep a core team in situ, or indeed if they can't keep a core team in situ, then continue to keep access to the sites, both in terms of your own sites and the storage facilities where you have objects currently being stored, because the risks will be around floods, fire, building controls, pests this time of the year. Obviously a lot more pests are going to come out. So it's just being very familiar with where your objects are, that either you have access to those buildings or that you can continue to ask for environmental data and security data from those venues where you don't have control over. So I think that for indemnity, the risks, they do stay the same, but they are clearly amplified, especially during lockdown and as you plan to emerge from lockdown. Because at that point, you need to be very aware of your emergency planning. And when you do look at it, when you do start to make those decisions of whether objects can be moved, given that conditions of 24-hour lockdown is very different to 10 weeks lockdown, when you're taking those decisions on the timing of movement, you really have to look at the condition reports, of course, and whether or not the objects are fit to travel.
Yeah, no, I definitely would sort of mirror what Carol said. I think from a commercial insurance point of view, we've been very sort of reassured by all our clients who have had to see lockdown and the measures that they put into place to keep all the works secure, both from an environmental point of view and from a security point of view. And sort of slightly ironically, in some ways, you could almost say if you've got key essential members of staff, such as security officers, such as someone who's able to sort of visit the premises on a fairly regular basis, who knows about the artworks to check over them, that in some ways the risk has slightly improved. in that there's less manipulation of the works. You haven't got the general public there breathing. And you know, so there is the sort of the two sides of the coin. Obviously, in the lockdown situation, you haven't got anything like the same level of general supervision of the works, members of staff there at all times. But the fact that the works have been allowed to sort of lie dormant, as it were, sort of unvisited, not being moved, in some ways, with the measures that have been put in place through essential members of museum staff still being present, insurers have been relatively relaxed about extending during this period and maintaining exactly the same cover. I think once lockdown is lifted, like Carol says, I think we just have to be very conscious of condition checking, making sure those works that are particularly vulnerable, I would have thought, to climate, minor changes in climate, are given a very sort of thorough condition check. And I would have also thought, depending on how many staff do actually come back once restrictions are lifted, that there's enough sort of human presence in the museums once the sort of general operation becomes slightly more complicated, in that works will have to be moved. You've got comings and goings, and just really making sure that enough members of staff actually return to work to make sure that all those extra operations and manipulations can be done with the usual sort of levels of quality that insurers and indemnity providers expect.
Might I just follow up on that, please? So the question obviously said whether there was specific advice around the condition reporting, because this was an element that came up in the webinar on Thursday with Adam Prideaux, and it's something that we had identified. But actually, you were saying about when the operations become more complex. So do you have any specific advice about managing that condition reporting for returning loads from exhibitions, especially if there is potential for delays or layovers in warehouses, for example, on the way back? Yeah, perhaps if Carol, you could start.
Sorry, I missed that. Sorry, because I think I'm hearing somebody else on the line. I'm not sure. Could you just repeat that again for me?
I will. So it was just to follow up on that a little bit, but as the operations become a little bit more complex, as things start to move back to the back towards museums from exhibitions that are deinstalling, are there specific bits of advice that you might have about the transfer of risk and how condition reporting is managed, and whether there are particular issues around layovers in warehouses?
I mean, well, for indemnity, I mean, what is clear is at each stage, in terms of managing condition reporting, every movement you would have to carry out some sort of condition reporting. And I would suggest that you just keep continuing to check and obtain records of environmental data and security data as objects begin to move. Was that the main gist of your question?
What I was wondering is that there may be more complexities built into return transports, for example, as things are going on, as institutions might have slightly reduced staffing levels, that transport agents might have reduced number of crews on the road, and there may be issues around prioritising other kinds of freight or other kinds of movement at the moment. These will be conversations that that borrowers have with their shippers and their agents, and it will be very interesting to hear, from them. I mean, what we're doing in terms of indemnity is just giving reassurance that the indemnity will remain in place. If an extension is needed, or if alternative cover for alternative venues is required, then we will work with the borrowing institutions to put that indemnity in place. And hold tight to the spirit of the scheme, because if we issue extensions, it has to be for a particular period of time. It can't be for an ever-ending
open end date. The spirit of the scheme is always about the public benefit and the fact that we are managing it on a risk assessment process. So in terms of logistics, transferring cover, putting conditional reporting in place, maintaining that, it's the same as what the current guidelines suggest and what the requirements are in place. And it's probably those conversations that they're having in terms of planning ahead, planning those logistics, making sure that there's little handling of objects, unnecessary handling of objects, picking up on Robert's point around maybe a skeleton staff or staff that are not as familiar with GIS. So it's that communication has to be transferred and translated across the teams. And yeah, I think that's the main thing. I mean, planning ahead is going to be the real success. You can't plan enough, I think, in terms of the logistics, as I say, minimizing many of these risks that, as I say, aren't necessarily more risks, but are different and amplified and heightened in certain circumstances.
Yeah, I agree with Carol. We're obviously in a slightly different position in that we don't have quite the same level of requirements because, as Carol said, government indemnity is there for the public benefit, and therefore there are much greater stipulations because it's coming from government. I think commercial insurers can probably be slightly more relaxed. What everyone is aware of is that there are works around the world at the moment that couldn't get from destination A to destination B and are stuck somewhere in the middle in warehouse X, which isn't obviously ideal. And I think commercial insurers, sort of their main sort of recommendation would be as soon as reasonably possible without in any way putting the work in any sort of greater danger than should happen, is to get those works back to their owners as soon as possible and condition checked. And then we're starting to sort of then level up a bit, and everyone's sort of aware of what their situation is and the condition of the works, of course. But at the moment, it's simply sort of having to sit tight and hope that everyone's looking after works that are in their care as best as they possibly can.
One of the benefits, we were working very closely with the boroughs, with the institutions in the run-up to lockdown. And of course, as country borders began to close down, we were reassessing and putting alternative cover in place. And we managed to approve all of the secure storage warehouses across the world where the objects just ended up. So one of the positives is in going forward is that we have a lot more warehouses that are approved for GIS, so they meet the minimum requirements for GIS, which is great. A lot of hard work in putting it in place, but we have that benefit in going forward.
If I can move on to the next question then. So given the different pace at which different countries and areas within the UK might relax restrictions, and the fact that social distancing regulations would likely still apply, would there be space to adjust requirements over vehicle crewing or courier supervision, for example?
Well, for government indemnity, it's a UK government indemnity, as everyone's aware, and the current GIS policy and guidance remains in place. So there's no question at the moment of relaxing the requirements. And I would just encourage everybody and urge everybody to follow, in particular, Annex D and E in terms of the general conditions for security and environment and for transport. So irrespective of the different approaches across the world, in Europe and indeed across the UK, we would urge everybody, the requirement is to follow the guidance. Obviously more government guidance on social distancing comes into play, and we'll hear more about that over the next couple of days, weeks. And again, it'll be how the transport agents can respond to that. It still remains that we would require 2 drivers for long distances and a driver and a courier for short distances. That's what it states in the guidance. It could be that a second vehicle is used, because obviously social distancing is going to cause an issue around that. It will have an impact on that, and whether or not the shippers, the transport agents, can get hold of adequate PPE. So there's a lot that will need to be considered, but in terms of the parameters and the requirements, that it would remain in place for indemnity. So crewing of vehicles is given in Annex E, and as I say, that remains in place. There are obviously what was announced today, quarantine rules as well that we need to be very mindful of. So that will have an immediate impact on drivers if they're not exempt from that, and of course couriers. Indeed, it's going to have a huge impact on couriers. For indemnity, we don't require a courier unless a lender has asked, or a borrower has asked for additional cover. So that will be for war, risk and negligence. Otherwise, we don't insist on couriers. But that's why for indemnity, we do insist on a fine art shipper, because they will often carry out that role. Because we must be mindful that a driver is responsible for the vehicle, and then whoever is taking on the responsibility for the courier, it's therefore looking after the objects. So you need those complementary roles and responsibilities being carried out, irrespective of the journeys. So that's what I would say in terms of not necessarily relaxing restrictions, but being absolutely mindful of social distancing, vehicle crewing, and the impact that that's going to have on couriers.
Yeah, I agree. I think obviously there are going to be logistical issues, which Carol has mentioned, social distancing being the main issue as to how you get around that, whether it's PPE or some other measure. I think insurers would look at commercial insurers would look at each case on its individual merits. So they would look at the value at risk, they would look at the media of the objects and sort of their relative fragility. And I think because Carol talks about the different annexes and the sort of the standards that are imposed by GIS, then obviously insurers are able to follow sort of in sort of, follow those conditions and don't tend to make any additional sort of requirements, because they know that the imposition of those requirements by GIS are already extremely high. So yeah, I think insurers would just be very happy to work as far as they can with each and every client that they have. They know that museums and galleries, their most important sort of requirement is to conserve and to manage risk, and therefore insurers will listen to any reasonable requests that museums and galleries make, which may be the absence of couriers because of quarantine, perhaps with lower sums insured, not having 2 people on the vehicle if the voyage is direct between location A and location B. So I think it will be on individual merits and various different degrees of fragility of objects, that sort of thing.
Just to throw into the mixture, is there museums at the moment are having to look towards different models, so such as remote supervision of installation or de-installation using a platform like this? What's your view on those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything that can be done, in the absence of what we're used to, which is just, having man and woman power in place to sort of overcome the difficulty we'll be facing for the next possible 12 months, I think would be encouraged by the insurance industry. I think there is just a general view from special insurers that museums and galleries do their absolute utmost to manage risk. And therefore, I think they would generally be happy to listen to what museums and galleries are considering doing in the absence of people being able to travel, being able to oversee, as we used to be able to do so. So video conferencing, I'm sure, would be encouraged and accepted by insurers if that's the only solution that we can find during the sort of interim period of quarantine and social distancing.
Yeah, I would add that so much of this is based on trust and expertise that is absolutely to the fore in terms of the expertise within the museums. And the number one primary condition for GIS is that the borrower shall at all times be responsible for ensuring the greatest possible care is taken of the indemnified objects. So that's really our starting point, and any decisions that the borrower is taking, we know that they're taking it mindful of their responsibility and their knowledge and expertise, and in conversation with the transport agent and other major stakeholders involved.
Thank you very much. Just to finish up, I suppose, last quick question. So we've all been very grateful for how responsive Arts Council England and the insurers have been over extensions and so on, but what's been the most complex challenge for you?
Well, for me, after I think turning on a pin and setting up the GIS team remotely and putting in electronic signatures, which I've been campaigning for 5 years, and to get that to be agreed within 24 hours was a huge achievement, I think. And it meant that we could then proactively focus on extensions and alternative cover and renewals. So that's really what we've been doing. I mean, it's probably worth saying that in the last 7 weeks, we've had over 230 requests for extensions and renewals and alternative cover. Majority from the nationals, 135 from nationals, and the rest from the non-nationals. I'm aware of 71 cases of renewals coming up in the next 6 months. So we need to really protect those objects which are currently in lockdown, where there is a potential of indemnity expiring, and we don't want there to be a gap in cover. Gaps in cover mean more work in terms of condition checking, as you know, and we want to keep it as seamless as possible. The only requirement that I really ask for is that we only act on applications. We need the application from the borrowing institution, we need the loan sheet, and then we can process it as quickly as possible. I did manage just before the lockdown to secure quite a substantial increase from Treasury in terms of the contingent liability. So we've got that contingent liability, that backup from Treasury and government, so that we can do this shifting and looking at extensions and how they coincide with exhibitions and the ambitious programming that everybody had planned. You know, it is heartbreaking. We spent so much time working with institutions to get these, you know, indemnity in place for these loans, and it is heartbreaking to know that they're in lockdown and, you know, they're being postponed. But I'm certainly keeping very close contact with the borrowing institutions, looking at the forecasts and looking how we can support, because GIS is open for business and all the experts are there. So the National Security Advisor and his consultants, and our environmental advisor and his and his advisors are available. So any issues that anybody has, you know, we can do that. We can put that in place. So I think that the challenge really was to just keep business open, business as usual, and stay in contact with the borrowing institutions.
Yeah, I suppose from a commercial insurer's point of view, sometimes it's quite complicated getting the message across that if you are going to extend, you're possibly going to have to pay an extra premium. because museums and galleries are, are one of the major victims really of lockdown, and therefore having to sort of ask money for them in what most of us consider to be a sort of force majeure situation can be quite a sort of a delicate kind of conversation. But if you've got very large values at risk, unfortunately, if insurers are on risk for a longer period of time, then they do need to charge a premium for that. And sometimes that does feel, from a broker's point of view, like you're slightly rubbing salt into the wound. The other issue, which I'm sure Carol has come across, is simply, I was talking earlier about works either arriving at venues where the crate remains unopened, having come from a prior venue covered by the prior venue's insurance. And because the crates remain unopened either in an intermediate storage facility or the next venue, but just sitting there unopened, is just making sure that the two institutions are speaking to each other in very clear, unambiguous ways about which insurance policy is in place. If the works remain unopened, then obviously it's vital that the original insurance policy that was covering the transit does remain in force for what can be a sort of an indeterminate period sometimes, until everyone is given sort of clear and new instructions as to whether the exhibition that has arrived at venue B is actually going to take place, or whether those works are then in fact going to be returned to their lenders. And it's just making sure that all the insurers or indemnity providers who potentially could be taking on that risk are aware of whose risk it is, and if it is going to switch, at what point that's going to switch, which has obviously got to be at condition check. But whether that's condition check at venue B, who will in fact have the exhibition, or whether it's going to be a condition check upon return to lenders, because unfortunately everyone's out of time. So it's just keeping that communication going and making sure that everyone's aware of who's on risk and if and when that risk is going to switch to another provider.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you very much indeed for all of your advice. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Robert. So everybody, please keep in touch on the UKRG website and the Twitter feed. Bear in mind that there will continue to be changes over the next few days as well. So always keep an eye on the situation, and we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.